Humanities here at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. Today, we have a very exciting presentation lined up from Professor Adam Crymble, who's joining us from UCL in London. I want to quickly mention, however, the next talk in the series, which will be coming up in November, I believe, which will be Barbara McGivery from nearby KCL, who's going to be talking to us about her work in computational linguistics, especially as it relates to Western classics. Today, however, it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker, as I mentioned, Professor Adam Crymble, who's Associate Professor of Digital Humanities in the Department of Information Studies at University College London. His work ranges very widely across a number of fields. I can particularly commend to you his book, Technology and the Historian, and also encourage you to look at his website and the various other projects that he's been engaged with. Today, he is going to be talking to us on a topic of great interest to us here at CUHK, that of global digital humanities. The plan is for a 45-minute presentation today, followed by 30 minutes of questions. So during those first 45 minutes, if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat, and I will relay them to Professor Crymble. So without any further ado, and without any more from me, I'll pass the virtual mic over to our speaker. Professor Crymble, Adam, it's over to you.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me, and thank you everybody also for coming along. It's great to have an opportunity to discuss a topic like this with people who are working in another context. So I'm excited also to hear what everybody is up to working in Hong Kong and how that relates to some of the experiences that I'm going to talk to you about today. But I'm going to start off with this idea of what are the most important digital research skills that the next generation of humanities students need to learn. And I think it's easy for us to assume that there's a clear answer to a question like that, because after all, technology is global, and there are important technologies emerging, such as artificial intelligence, that I think we probably all do need to learn at least a little bit about so that we can adapt to our changing world. But I am going to argue today that the answer to this question of what digital research skills we need to learn depends quite a lot on where you live. And I'm going to give you some examples from around the world that I hope convinces you that I'm right. So in the next few minutes, I'm going to draw on examples from countries that heavily use the English and Spanish languages, including the United Kingdom, India, United States, Mexico, Spain, and Colombia. What I'm going to try to show you is that English speakers need different digital skills than Spanish speakers, but also that Spanish speakers from one region have different needs than Spanish speakers from somewhere else. And of course, the same would be true for other languages as well. I'm also going to try to end with a little bit about my experience of teaching students from China and how I've discovered, or how I think their needs have differed from some of my Western students. And I think this is all important to discuss because if you're working on something groundbreaking in your region, you might find that there's less support for learning what you need to know, not only in your native language, but also in the support network of researchers that you have access to. And you may also find that your educators aren't really aware that what they're offering might not meet your needs, because sometimes I think we can't see our own biases and our own blind spots. But first, and Stuart's already mentioned this, I just thought I'd give you a little bit of an insight into who I am and how I've come to know these things, or at least believe that I know these things. So I'm a historian by training, and so the examples I'm going to give you tend to be historical, but I think the message is relevant for other humanities disciplines as well. In particular, I research migrant experience in the 1700s, but my real interest is how digital methods can help us to better understand these migrants over and above if we were just using traditional historical techniques like reading material in the archives. So this means that as a researcher, I'm always on the lookout for new methodologies that I can apply to my work. And this experience of looking at what's out there led me to write a book a few years ago called Technology and the Historian, which looks at some of the key ways that the digital era has transformed the way that we study and teach the past. I was really motivated to write that book because I was one of those historians that was being influenced, but I was also having trouble explaining to my colleagues in the United Kingdom why the work I was doing was valuable. And if you can't tell from my accent, I was not born in the United Kingdom. I was born in Canada, and I'd done my first 2 degrees there, university degrees. So I'd really already been molded by the Canadian university system. But then I moved to the UK and I did my PhD and I started teaching at a university in Britain. And it took a while for me to realize it. But my colleagues in Britain had a very different idea of what I should be working on than I did. And eventually I figured this was a cultural difference around the role of the university and the way that technology had found its way into history classrooms differently on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean. So I wrote a book to look not just at how digital technology was influencing scholarship, but also how it was influencing, how those influences were similar or different in Canada, the UK, and the USA. So that's really what motivated me to think about these global and local differences that we're talking about today. And I've kept thinking about those problems and I've kept writing about them too with colleagues all over the world. I've also got lots of experience using digital research methods in my migration history work. Those new methodologies that I just mentioned, I love applying them to my own research questions, but I don't invent these methodologies. I steal them from other people, or borrow them with credit, I suppose you could say. So usually these are people who work in different disciplines from my own. And as many of you will know, we call this interdisciplinary research because each discipline is different and it has members that think and solve problems in certain ways. So I like to treat other disciplines a bit like a menu at a restaurant. We've got a menu of skills that we might find useful to learn something new for using it in our own home discipline. So when I have a research problem, I ask myself which other discipline would have a similar type of problem to see what I can come up with to solve my problem using their solutions. And then hopefully, if it works well, I end up with something new. So for example, I have up on the screen here, I was faced with a challenge a few years ago of finding Irish people in a huge set of old records about London. The problem was the only reliable piece of information that I always had about these people was their name. So the research question became, how do you identify Irish people reliably using just their name? I did manage to find a solution to this. It's a historical problem, but I found a solution in linguistics, and it's a subfield called onomastics, which is the study of names. And I was able to build on what people had done in that field to identify a small number of names that were reliably linked to Irish ancestry in the time period that I was looking at. Now, we can't say that every single person with an Irish name was born in Ireland, but when you go back in time before lots of global migration was happening, the connection between an Irish name and experience of living in Ireland was much stronger 250 years ago. So the method worked fairly well for the research problem that I had, although it wasn't perfect. So a solution from linguistics gave me a tool that let me ask questions about my original records, at least in broad terms, such as how did these Irish named people appear differently or similarly to the local born people in the same set of records? In other words, was the Irish experience here unique? And it turned out it was in lots of interesting ways. And it was really only possible for me to see that by applying this technique that I had borrowed from linguistics. But I'm not just interested in linguistics. I've also taken methodologies from geographers. And I was fortunate to work with a talented geographer named Adam Dennett a few years ago, and he introduced me to a technique called gravity models. A gravity model is really interesting for someone like me studying migration because it lets me estimate how many people will migrate between two places based on all sorts of criteria, like how far away are those two places, what are the populations at the destination and the origin, is unemployment on the rise in one of the locations. So for example, using a gravity model, we might be able to estimate that, let's say 4,000 students are going to move from Beijing to London to study next year, and maybe only 1,500 will move from Hong Kong to London. You can then look at the actual numbers of how many people did move, and you can compare that to your estimates. And when we do that, maybe we find that there are fewer than expected students from Beijing, maybe there are more from Hong Kong. And that lets us as scholars then say, okay, well, why are these patterns different than the estimates? And we can then start to get a baseline for knowing when something unusual is going on in migration terms, and then start to answer the question of why that might be happening. So this method, very different than the linguistics one. This one's rooted in geography. It uses mathematics to predict and try to explain patterns of migration. And as I said, it's quite different from the linguistic solution I already mentioned. Very different types of questions possible. And again, I was able to use this with my colleagues to explain some patterns of migration into London in the 1700s from different parts of the country. So it was very effective for us to work across and to learn these new skills. Now, those are just two examples from my own work, and there are lots of people doing even more interesting things than me in those interdisciplinary spaces. All around the world, people are trying to learn what we would call, I think, interdisciplinary or perhaps digital skills to support our humanities work. But it can be really difficult to learn these interdisciplinary skills, especially if you're not trained in the techniques of another discipline. Perhaps you don't even know anybody in that discipline, so you don't even have somebody that you can turn to ask for support. So to support that self-learning, some of my colleagues and I built a platform to help, which we called Programming Historian. Now, this platform offers free online tutorials to introduce technology or a research method that might be useful to humanities scholars. Tutorials are submitted by scholars from all around the world, and you're all very welcome to submit a tutorial or a suggestion for a tutorial if you have something that you'd like to share. And all of them are peer-reviewed and tested to ensure quality. And it's been running since 2008, and it now operates in 4 languages, 4 European languages. We have English, Spanish, French, and Portuguese. In total, there are more than 200 individual tutorials. That's across all 4 of those languages. And I'd encourage you to have a look if you are looking to explore and learn new digital skills in the humanities, and if you speak any of those 4 languages, or if you're happy to use a translation program, I'm sure you can move them into the language of your choice. Now, within this set of tutorials, there's even a tutorial on how to use those gravity models. You can see the little header of that here, Introduction to Gravity Models of Migration and Trade, which I wrote after having successfully learned about that new methodology, and I thought maybe other people would want to learn that as well. And that's fairly typical of kind of the scope of a tutorial. So each tutorial will focus on a single skill, and it'll provide a case study that the reader can work through and try out that skill on a set of materials that we hope will work and give them a bit of success. And then ideally, they'd be able to then apply that to their own materials as well. Some of these focus on digital mapping skills. Some of them focus on fundamentals of programming languages. Some focus on building databases to store cultural heritage data. And there are lots of other topics. So it's a huge range of topics. And over the past decade that I've been working on this project, I've been fortunate to learn from colleagues who are working all around the world and in different languages. And one of the things you might notice if you visit the Programming Historian website is that the lessons in different languages don't necessarily cover all of the same topics or skills. Some of them do. For example, a lot of the lessons in Spanish are actually translations of the original English tutorials. But there are lots of English lessons that the Spanish team didn't bother to translate. And there are also Spanish lessons that are original to the Spanish publication, some of which aren't available in English. So each language has its own set of tutorials, and they're not all the same as one another. Now, the reason for this difference is because in the Spanish case, the Spanish editorial team, who's responsible for content, had been working hard to create materials that they thought were most useful for their audiences. This team, which lives across the Spanish-speaking world in both Europe and the Americas, knows what it's like to work in the humanities in their country. And they know that not everything that's useful to learn for people in the United States or the United Kingdom, for example, is useful for people in Colombia or Mexico. And this is the same for all 4 of the languages that we support. We have a native speaking local team to run each publication, and they do so in a way that they believe provides the most relevant tutorials and skills for their linguistic audience. We've learned that there are certain demand differences for certain skills around the world through that work that we've been doing. And one of the best ways to demonstrate those differences in what people are looking for is to look at patterns of visitor traffic to the programming historian tutorials over the years. And like many websites, Programming Historian has web traffic data. So when you visit the website, you get information about, we get information about what pages you visited and where you visited from. And this is done via a Google tool called Google Analytics, which is fairly widely used by website owners in a number of countries. And it provides an easy to use dashboard that helps us as the website owners better understand our users and how we might serve their needs better. Now, Programming Historian has this traffic data dating back almost a decade because the site, because the site's had millions of visitors over time, we have a fairly rich set of information about which tutorials are popular in different parts of the world. And last year, one of my postgraduate students in my department, a PhD student, worked together with me to analyze the regional patterns of tutorial traffic to build up a better understanding of how demand differs in different cultures. So to do this, we took 3 years of the data, the traffic data from the website, to look at which tutorials were most and least popular in English and Spanish. And to get an even better idea of regional differences, we looked at the 3 countries who ranked top for English language traffic. So that's the United States, India, and the United Kingdom, and the 3 who ranked top for Spanish language traffic, which was Spain, Mexico, and Colombia. So together, these 6 countries represented more than half of all traffic to the tutorials in the 3-year period, so just over 2 million users. To understand the data, we first classified every one of those lessons in the collection into one of 6 categories based on the primary learning outcome or the key skill that was being taught by the tutorial. So those categories are data handling. So this is anything to do with cleaning data, manipulating data, getting access to source material. Research analysis lessons. So this is like the ones that I was describing to you in my own research. This is putting data or material or information through some kind of a computational process with the goal of generating new knowledge about that, gaining insights into what that data can tell us. There's also web development skills. So these are technologies that are commonly used to build websites or apps, such as HTML, CSS, things like that. Programming or encoding. We have a number of tutorials on the R programming language, on Python programming, also encoding skills such as Markdown or XML, if you're familiar with either of those. We have a few lessons as well on working with audio visual material, anything non-textual such as sound files or video files. And then finally, operating system basics. So really quite basic ones on how to use your computer effectively, learning how to use some command line skills, things that are more about upskilling your technology and your computer skills, I think. Now, this very basic classification showed us that the project editorial board for English and Spanish had focused on quite different categories in different proportions for their publications. So, for example, the most prominent English language category was research analysis. So these are tutorials that provide skills for doing the type of interdisciplinary research that I've already described to you earlier, such as the gravity model lesson that I wrote and discussed. That would be a research analysis lesson. In Spanish, data handling made up the biggest group of lessons, and there were also more programming and encoding lessons than there were in English. And this shows that the editorial board thinks that data handling and programming are more important skills for their audience. And the English editorial board has decided that interdisciplinary research skills are most important. So we've got a linguistic cultural difference starting to appear. What did the readers think, though? I mean, it's one thing to say this is what the editorial board thinks. What did the readers think? So this is a graph showing that. Which tutorials did they actually want to read? Well, when we compare the categories to the number of website visitors, we see certain categories are getting more than an average number of readers per lesson. So if you look at this graph, anytime you see one of the columns going above either the black or the red line, that's an indication that those lessons are far more popular on average than other lessons. So these are topics that people are more interested in. And then obviously the opposite is true if it's below those lines. Now, what we can see here then is that overwhelmingly visitors to English language tutorials, regardless of their geographic origin, are using Programming Historian to learn web development skills. In the case of India, this is even more so, with 6 in 10 unique visitors clicking on a web development related tutorial. Just under half of the USA and the UK are also looking at web development tutorials. So these are skills including building web APIs, application programming interfaces, creating augmented reality experiences, and building static websites. The skills within these lessons have obvious relevance to humanities scholars, particularly anybody who wants to build a web-based output, but they also provide key skills of broad relevance to anybody building both simple and advanced websites. And I'm not sure if you're aware, but India has a very large web development and tech industry, particularly in the Bengaluru area of southern India. And these accessible and open learning resources on Programming Historian are evidently being used widely by professionals or would-be professionals seeking to pick up new web skills. Also prevalent among these English site users were data handling skills, which account for about 1 in 5 visitors to the site. This included skills such as downloading web content with Python or transliterating text with code, so moving between different character sets, such as Mandarin Chinese to the Latin alphabet, cleaning data or using regular expressions to clean up machine transcriptions. The final significant group of readers in the English-speaking site were those studying research methods. And these are the skills that are most directly relevant to the analysis of data. That's the stuff that's most interesting to me, of course, as I'm sure you've already realized. Now, these skills could, in some cases, be more broadly applied to data-related questions, but the tutorials on the site, this is a set that's most likely, I think, to appeal to humanities or digital humanities researchers, as well as data scientists and scholars from other academic disciplines. These include lessons on network analysis, corpus analysis, topic modeling, sentiment analysis, stylometry, just to name a few. If you aren't familiar with any of these approaches, it's probably enough to know that they're all interdisciplinary research skills that could help someone in the humanities answer certain types of research questions in new ways. Now, these skills do have some commercial and political value in specialist industries, but they are used less commonly than basic programming or web development skills. Notably, while still used in India, so about 10% of Indian traffic was coming to read some of these skills, this research-focused set of tutorials was much, much more common in the UK, where 19% of visitors were using them, so almost double, or in the USA, 17%. And this is the biggest measurable difference between Indian visitors and those from the UK and the USA at this category level. And it might reflect a greater emphasis on publishing analysis-based research in Western university working cultures. And the fact that we think that a lot of the Indian visitors are actually professionals rather than researchers. The broad patterns of use in Spanish, you can see, are quite different. The colored bars, very different patterns. Web development tutorials were only a fraction as popular in Spain, Mexico, and Colombia as they are in the English site. About 1/10 of readers came to learn web development skills in Spanish compared to about half of English readers. Instead, overwhelmingly, Spanish visitors read tutorials on data handling skills. These tutorials were 3 times more popular in Spanish than in English, if you account for the readership size differences, that is. Now, these include a series of lessons that use Python to manipulate and clean up textual content downloaded from the internet. Data handling tutorials made up the same proportion of published lessons in both English and Spanish. So the fact that they're used much more frequently in Spanish is very notable. The next most common read lessons were basic programming or encoding tutorials, including some generic advice on setting your computer up for Python programming, which were more advanced and were more popular than some of the more advanced skills. And this suggests a need for ground setting tutorials, basic tutorials that may not be as widely available in Spanish as they are in English. This set of lessons also included a series about the Text Encoding Initiative, or TEI, which you may know about. These were written in Spanish, but they haven't been translated into English. And I think the key reason for that is the Text Encoding Initiative documentation is already available widely on the internet in English. So the Spanish team decided that there was an opportunity to make these skills accessible in Spanish. The English team realized they didn't need to do that for English readers because that material was already available elsewhere. The category I think most notably lacking in readers, for Spanish readers anyway, is research analysis, despite nearly 1/4 of Spanish tutorials covering some form of analysis skill. And the readership actually here only hovers around 4% in all 3 of the Spanish-speaking countries examined. So that's quite a difference, I think, between English and Spanish. Why is that? Well, I think, at least in the case of Colombia, it might be down to historical factors. And I think my colleague Maria Jose Afanador-Yach has the best explanation for that. Dr. Afanador-Yach has been a longstanding member of Programming Historian, and she's also based in Bogota in Colombia. She and I co-hosted a workshop in Bogota in 2018 to help bring together Spanish speakers from around Latin America to create some of the first Spanish programming historian tutorials. Now, having spent some time in Colombia, it allowed me to better understand the type of work that people were doing there, as well as the type of things they weren't doing, which I was expecting to see. One of the most notable things for me, as someone who'd been working in the United Kingdom, was the lack of digitized archival material available in Colombia. In the UK, about 20 years ago, we saw huge mass digitization projects that made material in our libraries and our archives available online, particularly English language material. This included sources such as newspapers, criminal and family history records, government records, and cultural sources like paintings and drawings. And there are now billions of individual records from countries like the United Kingdom available to access online. This means that for me, as an educator, I could teach my students how to use these new digital data analysis techniques to learn how to analyze all this new digitized material at scale. And a few years ago, at least in English, we called this distant reading, or how to find meaning in a body of materials that's just too big to read. But Maria Jose wasn't teaching those same digital analysis skills, at least not in her Colombian classroom. And that's not because the students couldn't understand these skills, but it's because Colombia never had that same mass digitization moment that we had in the UK. This is despite the fact that Colombia has a long history of written culture, so there's plenty of material that we might like to have digital access to. According to Dr. Afanador Yach, the reason that we don't have it in digitized form is because of the Spanish government, not the Colombian government, but the Spanish government. And the territories, as you may know, the territories that comprise Colombia today were for over 300 years the colonial territories claimed by the Spanish monarchy. This Iberian Empire built a complex bureaucratic machine made of papers, which were produced on both sides of the Atlantic. So a huge paper trail to administer this giant empire from the past. This created one of the largest colonial archives ever written, and it recorded information about the former colonies across Latin America as well as the Philippines. But today, most of that archive sits in Spain at the Archivo de Indias de Sevilla. This puts legal title of some of Colombia's most important historical documents with the Spanish state. So even if Colombians did want to digitize and make these resources available for data analysis, they don't have the legal means to force Spain to digitize them. Now that is a crucial problem that we still have to solve, I think. And Rupika Rassam, another digital humanities scholar, has suggested that within colonized and formerly colonized nations, and for people outside of dominant cultures, access to means of digital knowledge production is essential for reshaping the dynamics of cultural power and claiming the humanity that has been denied by the history of colonialism. And that's a quote from Dr. Rassam. So, Colombians wanting to use many of their own colonial era materials are thus at the mercy of Spanish policies and decisions about digitization, many of which were made many years ago, in the 1980s and in the 1990s, early 1990s, by people who at the time couldn't foresee a future where researchers would expect to be able to download and manipulate historical data, for example. Now, a huge number of documents are available online, but the infrastructure of these archives in Colombia cannot at present facilitate complex data analysis. Sorry, those are in Spain. They cannot facilitate complex data analysis. And there's very little that Colombians without advanced programming skills can do about that. So they're very limited by history what type of research skills that they can apply to materials about their country. Now, in the case of Colombian regional archives, it's even a less promising story. And this is for largely economic reasons rather than, although I suppose they're connected, historical and economic reasons are connected, but for economic reasons, many of the archives that hold valuable colonial documents have very precarious circumstances. So they have low budgets, poor enforcement of archival legislation, there's conservation problems, there's a lack of catalogs, and that's endangered some of the preservation activities across the country. There are international programs that are playing a vital role in supporting these archives, such as one in Britain called the British Library's Endangered Archives Program, which provides funding. But there's only so much of that funding available, and there's not enough to solve what's really a global problem for a lot of these countries that can't afford to preserve or digitize their material. There are some examples of some successful locally led digitization projects, and I've put an example on the slide here, Colombia's Neo Granadina, and that stands out as a shining example of a homegrown initiative to try to provide access to some important colonial Colombian materials. But there's a long way to go, I think, before Colombians have a similar level of digital access to their history. Colombians also sit on the outside of a global culture that remains English dominated in a number of ways, particularly in the Americas and in Europe. And it's been this way for a long time. English viewpoints persist in certain corners of the Colombian archive, both through what was originally created and what was made available in digital form. So for example, there are examples of English drawn maps of early colonial Colombia. But as far as we're aware, there are no early Columbian drawn maps of England. So we have English people looking at Colombia, but we don't have any records of Colombian people looking back at England. And the histories and the stories that we get about those countries are then sculpted in the image of what we have access to in terms of information. We might call this an informal archive of Britain. So they have an intellectual empire in Colombia, even though they never directly controlled the territory. English is also a challenge, I think, for many people trying to learn programming languages, at least the programming languages that I know, because the English language is part of many of those programming languages. So there are key words that you have to use in order to write programming code. And for example, in Python, which is very popular with humanities scholars, those are all in English. So some of those words include, this is just an alphabetical list of a few examples, but the word and, as, assert, break, class, continue. These are words in Python that you need to know how to use in order to write the language. And you also are, I think, at a disadvantage if you don't speak English, because as an English speaker, I can try to make sense of those words and try to remember what they do based on my understanding of the language and the word. But if you're doing that in a second language and you don't know those words, I think you're at a disadvantage. So there are a lot of barriers, I think, that English speakers don't have to face when it comes to learning some of these digital skills. What was digitized also sculpts the histories that we tell today. So the early priorities of commercial digitization companies based in what we sometimes call the global north had an impact on the development of digital skills in the global south, or places like Colombia. So these companies built many of the digital archives of primary sources in the early new millennium, so 10, 15, 20 years ago now, providing access often through expensive subscription fees that universities and libraries had to pay for. And these projects tended to focus on English language material because they could more easily be marketed to the larger American higher education industry in the United States. These companies have begun to diversify their offering and to include materials in different languages or created in different parts of the world. But for years, countries like Colombia were faced with a choice of either subscribing to English language archives or doing without any of these digitized materials at all. So this put English fluency, which is itself a sign of privilege in many countries, as a key barrier in front of Latin American historians looking to work with digitized materials. And I think that means that any insights made using these new methods, such as data mining, really only were able at the time to tell us about the English-speaking world. So as a result of these and other factors in Colombia and other Latin American countries, the type of digital work being done in the region is different than what we see in Europe. Colombia, therefore, is developing a digital approach that's best suited to Colombia and the wider societal and professional pressures in that region, such as the history and the economics that we already talked about. And sometimes those priorities align with what's going on elsewhere, but sometimes they don't. And I think that's fine. That's the local need prioritized over the global one. Now, if we can just turn back to that web traffic data and thinking about what I just said about those different regional needs, the programming historian data can start to help us explain some of the differences that we might see between different countries. And we can see this, I think, when we look at individual tutorials to think about individual skills. Now, most interesting for me are the interdisciplinary research skills lessons, and to compare these across countries, because I think those are the ones that we're probably most interested about today. And they're also the ones that I think show the greatest regional differences. So these are lessons that cover important digital research skills, but they're never going to appeal to hundreds of thousands of learners the same way that a web data or a generic web skills tutorial will do. Given their importance to digital research in the humanities and the gap between, as I mentioned, in the UK and the USA, this is about 20% of readers. In India, it's only 10% of readers. The relative popularity of these lessons is, I think, a good way to identify some of the regional differences in interest. So the graph here considers that relative ranking of individual lessons popularity as a way of kind of ironing out the fact that there are far more readers from the United States and the United Kingdom. So we get a ranking rather than the raw numbers. So this means that a lesson could actually have more readers in the USA, but it could be more popular amongst British readers in the UK. So there are 30 categories in this lesson in English, and as I mentioned, they cover topics like stylometry, corpus linguistics, topic modeling, geospatial skills, that gravity model lesson that I mentioned. These all have the potential to lead to new research knowledge on a range of humanities questions. Interestingly, I think the United Kingdom stood out in this category, having the highest ranking for 18 out of 30 of these research analysis lessons. And Britain was only at the bottom of the list for 3 of these lessons. So this suggests that for digital skill seekers in the UK, skills that can lead to peer-reviewed humanities research findings are of greater importance than in the US, and particularly of greater importance than in India. And I think that might speak to the UK's emphasis on research outputs. And we also have a big ranking that happens every 7 or 8 years in the United Kingdom. Everybody's research is ranked for quality, and then universities make a lot of money or lose a lot of money depending on how well their staff rank. So there's a lot of pressure and a lot of emphasis on these types of research skills that may not be as foregrounded for American or Indian scholars. I think it also aligns with the nature of British humanities PhDs. So people studying for their final degree in the UK tend to do a fairly short period of intense research study, which results in a dissertation. Often this is only 3 or 4 years of work. In the United States, however, that same PhD tends to be 6 to 9 years long, and students spend a lot more time in the classroom taking courses and learning about background material. So there's a very different approach to the research environment there, and I think that's perhaps one of the reasons why we see these differences in which lessons are popular. Lessons in this category are relatively less popular in India. Half of the lessons, India's interest ranks the lowest of the 3 countries, and in a few cases it's substantially lower. You can see that with the taller bars here. The biggest outlier is a tutorial on corpus linguistics using a fairly easy to use tool that's aimed at aspiring linguists, it was pretty popular in Britain. It was the 21st most popular lesson, but 58th in India. And it's not immediately clear why this is less popular, because the tool itself is actually really quite useful for Indians. It can handle Indian scripts such as Hindi and Urdu. So its relevance to Indian scholars is high, but it's possible that people just haven't learned about it, haven't heard about it before. It doesn't have that local community supporting it the way that many people in the United Kingdom would already be familiar with it and maybe just needed a way to learn how to use it more effectively. There are a couple cases where India had the highest level of interest, but I think there might be some economic explanations for those particular tutorials. So there's one on sentiment analysis, which was most popular in India. And I think this could be linked to the fact that the data processing in the opinion mining industry, as it's called, companies will seek to capture kind of the pulse of social media chatter about their company. Politicians want to know what people are saying about their candidates, and they use this approach rooted in sentiment analysis to do that. And a lot of people hire companies in India to do that. So it looks like people are trying to learn those skills so that they can set up some of those businesses and take advantage economically of that opportunity. So overall, the variations that we see here, I think we can suggest there are some historic, some bureaucratic, and some economic factors that might explain some of the differences that we see. And we can also, when we look at Spanish, we can see different patterns, but there are still local patterns nonetheless. So for example, Spain stood out for its use of a lesson about linked open data. It's 25th most popular in Spain, but it's 42nd in Mexico and Colombia. Don't know if you know about linked open data, but it's fairly widely used in the European Union, and it's been adopted by the government of the European Union. So you can actually access European law, court judgments. You can use linked open data queries to access that material programmatically and do whatever you need to do with it. And there are big European-wide projects such as Europeana, which holds all of the catalogs of cultural heritage museum in Europe in one place, and they really support linked open data as well. But if you look at Latin America, there is not government buy-in yet for linked open data. They don't have the same use in the cultural sector there. So as a result, the lesson on it is much less popular. So a great example of a local need, a local environment, encouraging people to learn a particular skill, and the same factors are not there elsewhere. Mexican readers also have their own anomalies. So there's an introductory lesson on using Google Maps and Google Earth. This is far more popular in Mexico than it was elsewhere. And in Colombia, the biggest anomaly was a homegrown lesson. It was written by some Colombian authors using something called Map Warper, which is an English language tool which allows you to geo-reference or geo-rectify maps. So if you're not familiar with that term, that's about taking a digital image of a paper map and then you stretch it out using code or a tool so that it fits onto a map of the globe. And sometimes old maps weren't quite accurate, so we need to stretch them into place. The tutorial, that particular tutorial, used Colombian case study material, so they used Colombian maps, and they offered instructions in English, in Spanish, which for an English language tool means that tool is now more accessible for that Spanish language audience. And it was much more popular in Colombia than it was in the other two countries. So that suggests perhaps that mapping related skills and lessons written by Colombians with Colombian expertise were highly valued within that research community. The biggest Colombian anomaly in the other direction was a brief lesson on installing Python on a Mac. So similar tutorials are also available for installing Python on Linux computers or on Windows computers. And in Colombia, the Mac tutorial was by far the least popular of the three. In Spain, the Mac one was very, very popular. So that gives us a sense of what computers people are using as well. What technologies do they have access to? Presumably the Mac computers were too expensive for a lot of the Colombian users, but they were within the reach of more of the Spanish readers. Now, I don't want to oversell the variations here, but I do want to suggest that I do think I see differences, local differences, and I think we can explain some of these. And I think it's important for us, those of us who are thinking about these problems, to actually then be aware of those differences and make sure that we're making available skills that are not necessarily our own personal interests, but also the ones that our students and our university communities might need to learn. And we might just need to remind ourselves of some of those cultural blind spots to make sure that we can see where we all fit in that and make sure that we're not just learning what's easy to learn locally, but what's important for our own work. Now, I promised I'd end just a little bit thinking about China. And I think people in this room will probably know better than me, but I can reflect on what I've seen teaching on a master's level program for digital humanities in the UK, which attracts a large number of applications from Chinese students. We have a class on that program called Global Digital Humanities, and each week we look at a different region of the world. I'm lucky one of my colleagues, Jin Gao, who was originally from China, she does a lecture on digital humanities in China, and it was really interesting for me to learn about how some of the early digital skills that were important in the West around textual analysis and textual processing were actually really difficult to do in China at the time, because it took time to figure out efficient ways to encode the Chinese language in the computer, which had originally been designed for the Latin Western alphabet. So Dr. Gao took these students through these early attempts to create Chinese typewriters to demonstrate how the Western technology just wasn't really set up for the type of work that Chinese speakers needed to do. So China had to develop its own path and its own way of using technology to start to engage in this space, as I'm sure many of you are aware. And one of the really interesting things that I've come across with my students, because my students have to submit a written statement with their applications to say why they want to come to our program. And one of the things that really surprised me was the number of Chinese applicants who were really excited by virtual reality and augmented reality. And again, I was reading about the digital Dunhuang app and virtual reality tour of the Palace Museum. So these 2 museum-focused digital experiences are really impressive, and the students were excited to come to London to see, for example, what the British Museum was doing in the same space. Now, if you've ever been to the British Museum, you'll know they're doing nothing like this. There's no virtual reality, there's no augmented reality at all. They focus on very different things, and they've decided not to put their energy into that. And the other thing that I think my Chinese students are surprised by, not just that the British Museum isn't doing this, they're also surprised that my Western students aren't really interested in this stuff, at least not nearly as interested as they are. My students are much more interested in some of the research analysis skills that I've been talking about. They want to data mine materials and come up with new findings, and they're not as interested in this experience-focused technology. You may have reasons why you think that's the case, and I'd certainly be interested to hear what you think that might be, but that's certainly what I've been noticing about my Chinese students, which is again, I think, an example of local need. So I think the message I want to leave you with today is that where matters, where we're working matters on what we need to learn, and also what we're doing. There are local needs and global technologies, and I think it's important to make sure that we don't forget that variety of need. So I'd be very excited to hear and interested to hear what you're learning and what you're trying to work on for your own skills. But I hope I've managed to convince you that technology is not used the same way everywhere, and we should embrace that.
Great, thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. I learned a lot, and really the variety of kind of analysis that you've done based on the programming historian is tremendously impressive. You don't happen to have data on are there many visitors from mainland China or Hong Kong? I know that wasn't part of your analysis, but do you have a sense where that fits into the story?
We do have that data, but I have not analyzed it. It's not one of the bigger sources of traffic, but I think that's also because it hasn't been widely promoted to people in that part of the world yet. So that's not that surprising, but we would be able to dig into that, but I haven't done it yet.
Yeah,
and I might go back and do that now, because now I'm curious to see anything there.
Yeah, and presumably they would people from the PRC and from Hong Kong would be reading this material in English, presumably. But yeah, it'd be really interesting to see what they're looking at. So we have various questions that are coming in the chat. The first the first one I think is something that we should definitely get out of the way. Lily Chung asks, thanks for your presentation. I was also wondering if CUHK has access to these resources, the programming historian. I think the answer is yes, but here we go. Yeah.
I hope so. Yeah, they're all freely available online, so there's no subscription fee. You can just go to programminghistorian.org and you can access them. And if you need to translate them, by all means, go ahead. They're licensed with a Creative Commons license, which means you can repost them elsewhere. You can do whatever you need to do with them, as long as you find them useful. We're happy.
And teachers are encouraged to use them in the classroom.
Absolutely, yeah. I hope people find them useful in lots of ways. We encourage people to use them in classroom, in library-led workshops, anything that you need. They work well online and in person. So yeah.
Great, good. Yeah, it's certainly on the reading list of my digital humanities course. I can tell you that. So I'm wondering if we can also just mention. So we have a question here about the francophone context as well. The person notes, this is Huang Xiaodong, notes that there's also kind of a colonial dynamic there as well. Again, presumably there's data, but I don't know whether you've looked at it. for
Yeah,
that?
we have fewer published lessons in French than we do in Spanish. That's why I focused on the Spanish ones, because there is a lot more activity. And actually, I think one of the advantages of our Spanish team is that we have people who are based in the colonial countries, so Latin American countries. The Francophone team does not have anybody and has not had anyone from any of the post-colonial French territories. So I think the dynamic in those two have been different, but because there are fewer tutorials in French, I didn't focus on that for the analysis. I think, again, if I went in and looked, there would be some differences as well, particularly probably between readers in France and Belgium, so the European readers, and readers in Canada, for example. I would expect them to have different interests and needs, but I didn't look at that for this particular check.
Sure. Sure, yeah, and of course, French North Africa, there's some sort of specific context as well.
Yeah, I think we need to do
Yeah, that would
some
be
work to
interesting.
share the materials with those readers, and to find out also what skills they need to learn, because we shouldn't assume that they're the same ones that were the ones we've already offered.
Sure, absolutely. So I'm wondering if you could talk maybe. I saw that you're involved with the and you mentioned, of course, the students who come to London for your MA or MSc. I don't know which one it is. Your master's degree. It's both.
Yeah.
Oh goodness. Okay. So you mentioned sort of the different interests they have. I'm wondering how you sort of cater to that. Do you sort of offer students a lot of choices, or do you say these are the core things you're encouraged to learn, and then from there they can branch out?
Yeah, so I think one of the things I wanted to do with the class that I put together called Global Digital Humanities was to help everybody to see how their interests are actually sculpted by where they came from. And so by looking at those different regional case studies, you can see, oh, okay, like actually my interests are either very typical for where I came from, or they're quite different than people from where I came from. And you can start to then question what you've maybe not thought about yet, or maybe are there other things that I want to explore. We do tell them that there are different ways that people envisage. It's a program called Digital Humanities. So we say, you know, for some people that's about engaging with technologies in the cultural heritage sector. So that's virtual reality, augmented reality, digitizing materials in lots of interesting ways. In some cases, it's more what I was talking about from my own research, where we're doing the data analysis, bringing interdisciplinarity to humanities disciplines. So there are different approaches to it. We make them aware of those different those different approaches. And then it's kind of up to them to choose a path that they're most interested in. So we have a dissertation, which everybody does a dissertation, and everybody does a work placement as well. So you've got an opportunity to kind of specialize your interest at that point. But we try to make students aware of what else is out there, so that they're not missing out on it for not having thought about it before.
And are there either students or, I guess, sort of institutional pressures that kind of pull you in? I mean, the sort of the data science direction. This is I mean, certainly North American universities and to some extent here in Hong Kong as well. That's the kind of direction everyone is getting drawn into, is to put sort of data science plus in the names of their degrees and things like that.
Yeah, I think increasingly people are thinking about, how does the title of my degree affect my future prospects? And yeah, there's always an evolution for that. But I would say that some of the students that are interested in the virtual reality, I mean, I wouldn't say they're doing data analysis really. They're more in the media space and the creative industries, and quite artistic skills are required for that. And students bring with them, especially to interdisciplinary programs, they bring with them their previous degree, whatever discipline they've come from, and we put them all in a room with other people who have completely different backgrounds, and the only kind of shared interest is that we're interested in how technology can help us care about the humanities disciplines in new and interesting ways. So I think it's always fun to see that bringing people together. I spent most of my university time in history classrooms, and most historians approach problems in a in a similar way to one another. They might be more interested or less interested in numbers, or more interested in physical objects or written records, but they've got a way of thinking which they all help train each other to think in that way. And then you get these interdisciplinary spaces where we actually just throw a bunch of people together and say, let's try to talk together and learn from each other and do things differently, and bring some of those international perspectives together, and realize what we haven't yet thought about, which I think is cool.
Oh, absolutely. We have a follow-up question from Lily here. She asked, if we're looking for brackets new ideas of how to do something digital with our studies, is there anywhere you would recommend we can get these ideas from? Maybe, if we're working in a field that where there aren't very many models, are there any kind of models or sort of things you'd suggest people do?
That's a very good question, and it's a very difficult one to give an exact answer to, but I would suggest, I mean, depending on your level, so if you have an advisor or a supervisor, ask them if they have ideas. If you don't have a supervisor, then you're kind of on your own. Programming historian can be a good place to look, because you can just kind of scan through the different examples and get an idea of what's out there. There are also some journals have more interdisciplinary work in them than others. It depends on what your field is, but there would be a journal in your field that is a bit more experimental than the other ones. And you might just have to do some reading to see what other people are interested in or trying to do. It might not be in the famous journals that you're used to looking for in your field, because often those famous journals are quite conservative, and they protect what the discipline's good at rather than explore new opportunities. So I would encourage you to look at some of maybe the newer journals, or the ones that are less famous, I think would be my suggestion. But also just ask around. If you have someone in your field that is working on things, see if they'll have a chat with you or answer some emails and say, like, I'm just wondering what else is out there. Have you seen anything exciting recently? And maybe they can go for that. And there are lots of people in literature. You say you're in literature. There are lots of people in literature that are experimenting. So I hope you can find examples of people in maybe some of the smaller journals doing interesting things.
And you say you're in history, but is sort of either sort of computational linguistics or other sorts of distant reading methods, are they common in literature departments, or at UCL in particular, or in the UK?
They are super common in the United States. So there'd be a lot of Americans that are doing computational linguistics. There are people I do have colleagues as well that are working on that at UCL. But it's more popular and less popular in different countries. The United States has a lot of people that are working on that. And a lot of them actually publish in journals that will have digital humanities in the name of the journal. So you can find quite a lot of that stuff in there as well. Not all of it will be interesting to you, but it's a process of browsing until you find something that looks like it's solving the type of problem that you want to solve.
And I also noticed the department you're technically in is information sciences, information studies. Is that right?
Yes.
So how does that overlap with, I guess, digital humanities? And I guess there's information sciences as it relates to kind of librarianship classically, right?
Yeah, and our department originally was a librarian school, and it has an archives program as well. Yeah, it's always interesting how universities, where they put interdisciplinary work. And there was a decision made 20 years ago, I think, to put my digital humanities program in an information studies program. I think most of us in the program who teach on it would very happily see ourselves in one of the discipline-specific departments. So I tend to think my research interests overlap more with my colleagues in the history department than in my own department. But it's allowed us, I think, the space to experiment more, to be in a department that isn't as worried about the discipline and is more interested in how we can try new things. So the information studies department has been helpful for that. But I know in a lot of American universities in the United States, they put digital scholarship in either in the library. So a lot of my colleagues work as training technicians in the library, and their job is to help scholars to find what skills they need and where they can learn them. Or they're in English departments. It's very unusual for them to be in a history department or an information studies department. So it's done differently everywhere, and here that's how we do it. There's another university down the road, King's College London. They have their own department. They're completely independent. So it's done differently in lots of different places, and I'm not sure there's a correct way to do it, but I think as long as you've got somebody asking these questions in your university, and obviously you do, I think it's not as important where they are, as long as they're happy and that they're able to help people.
Yeah. Yeah, that's very interesting. Here in Hong Kong, it seems we're sort of scattered in different departments. It's HKU is probably the place with the most effort going into this at the moment. They have a separate undergraduate degree actually in digital humanities, but the faculty are housed within separate departments, mostly history and English literature. So it's good to see how the rest of the world is doing it, and there are many possibilities. So I see someone sent me another question in a private chat, and the question relates to I guess when you're beginning a project. So things like the programming historian have lots of different options. Should you try to create a multi-method project or a more focused project? Should you try and be sort of a jack of all trades or a master of one, I guess?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I mean, I have my own view on that. I'm not sure my view is universally correct, because I'm sure people are doing lots of interesting things. I think it depends on the level of study that you're doing, and if you are a seasoned veteran with 30 years of experience, or if you're maybe doing a master's degree or undergraduate work or something, I would have a different response to that. I would say do one thing well. So when you're learning these new skills, it's a good idea to try to get one thing working. And that's the same advice I give when I'm teaching people how to program, write programming code. Change one thing, make sure it does what you think it does, and then try to learn something new. And there's no reason why, as you get more experience, that you can't start to bring more things together. But there's an expression in English that we should walk before we learn to run. And I would say it's a good idea to do one thing at a time, at least when you're starting out.
Sure. And that's probably especially good advice, yeah, for masters and PhD students. It's better to keep your project, focused and excellent, rather than, getting lost in the weeds of various different things. Yeah, that's good advice. Very, very good advice. I guess a follow-up to question then is, I mean, what about potential sort of changes, right? I mean, people who are programmers have to learn new languages as they become important. Other things become obsolete. That, I presume, is also an important part of your kind of development as a digital humanist. You have to, something you learned 5 years ago might not be useful anymore.
Yeah. We just had on our program, actually, the master's program, we've just had a review of the skills that were being offered and recognized that some of them needed to go, and that we needed to bring in some new modules to rethink things, because technologies like artificial intelligence are more important than they were. People want to talk about machine learning more than they did a few years ago. Back in 2010, when our program was set up, there was a lot of emphasis on working with digital text, because that was the stuff that had been digitized and made available, and there was too much of it, and everybody wanted to know, how do we work with all this text? And now what we're finding is students want to work with visual material, they want to work with video, they want to work with sound. So we're having to adapt the skills that people want to learn to keep up with the fact that technology is changing. So we've de-emphasized a little bit some of the textual skills, and we've had to bring in some new people to bring in those skills that we were missing.
That would include, I guess, things like 3D scanning and 3D modeling, things like that.
Yeah, those modules always have to update. Yeah, you're right. Yeah. So what used to be a flatbed scanner where you would put a piece of paper down and you would take an image of it, it's different now. Yeah. So it's always learning in these spaces. You can't stop learning. You've got to keep looking at what's going on around you.
Yeah, and that's both, I guess, a sort of a challenge and an opportunity. It's what's the famous word? Crisis-unity or whatever. You're in a constant state of crisis-unity.
Can be exhausting sometimes. Sometimes you don't want to learn anything new, and that's fine, but it's always something.
Yeah, something we've become interested in here recently is 3D printing. We have some sort of industrial 3D printers down in the basement of our library. And yeah, we have a 3D printing competition actually this year for students. I shall take this opportunity to advertise. They should put in their entries soon. So I mean, that sort of intersection with the physical world, is that something you see as important to digital humanities as well?
Yeah, I think increasingly, yeah, we have. I think we're very open, and I'm very open to people using technology to make a difference, right? I think if you can get out, make a thing that does something, that's just as exciting as if it's something that happens within the screen of your computer, right? So yeah, but you're right. It's a different set of skills you needed to do that. You're now thinking about engineering, and bringing in another set of interdisciplinary talents, and design is another set of skills. So there's so many ways we can bring together skills in our different disciplines, and I think we're just seeing a proliferation of that right now. You can't learn it all. I think you're gonna have to just decide a few things you want to learn, and recognize that you're never going to know all of it. You've got to specialize a little bit anyway. There's only so much time in a lifetime that we have to choose how to use it.
Yeah, absolutely. But in terms of, I guess, a sort of an ideal department, or sort of an ideal educational program, it would cover, I guess, all the sort of areas that are covered in the programming historian. You had those 5 areas, right?
And more, probably. I'm sure we haven't come up with all the ideas, right? I mean, we're just one group of people, and others will find others. But I think it's important that we're aware that there's a lot of different things people might want to do, and that not necessarily from an educator standpoint, people don't necessarily want to be like me. They don't necessarily want to solve the same problems as me. So if I can be aware of the fact that what I know isn't necessarily the solution to their problem, then I think that takes a little bit of pressure off me to feel like I need to be the expert. What I can instead be is the person that says, okay, let's go looking for that solution together. And I think that's just a positive thing.
Yeah, absolutely. It's especially as you say, you attract a lot of students from all over the world. Here in Hong Kong, the situation is sort of interesting. We have both local students from Hong Kong, and then a lot of students who come from mainland China, and a sort of another tranche who come especially from Southeast Asia. So we in fact have some of the similar dynamics to you, with sort of non-local students with kind of different. They come from a different system and sort of different priorities potentially. So that's great. So I see we are coming up just about to our 6:15 here, which is when we said we would finish off. It was a tremendous talk, and it's been a very stimulating discussion. Thanks to all the students for their questions. I hope you have learned as much as I have from this great presentation. Do remember our upcoming meetings. They will be, as I mentioned, I think our next meeting is November 6th, but you'll receive an email as usual about it. And we will be continuing into term 2 this year. Last year, we just had talks in term 1. We'll also be having talks in term 2. Great. So I guess all that remains is for us to thank our speaker and wish him all the best with his ongoing projects. Okay.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks a lot, everyone. Goodbye.